Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the massive and incredible catalogue from one of the greatest, most celebrated, decorated, iconic and respected pianists of all time. And for my money, when it's all said and done, will go down in history as perhaps the greatest piano player of all time. He is in my Mount Rushmore with Pat Metheny, Chick Corea and Miles Davis, and is a cornerstone for the ECM label, and is one and still continues to be one of the most important voices for the piano, and has been for the past 50 plus years now. And this is a musician who I have been wanting to talk about on this series for a really long time now. I have talked about him once before, where I discussed his entire catalogue of trio albums, and for today's special edition, I am going to be discussing his catalogue of solo piano albums. And this is a guy, quite frankly, he needs no introduction whatsoever. I am talking about, of course, the one and only legendary pianist, composer, and bandleader, Keith Jarrett. So ever since bursting onto the scene in the 1960s, Keith Jarrett has seen it all, done it all, played and collaborated with just about everyone, from Chet Baker to Freddie Hubbard, to his brother Scott Jarrett, to Airto Moreira, to Bob Moses, to Paul Motian, to Gary Peacock, to Jack DeJohnette, to Kenny Wheeler, to Marion Williams, to Miles Davis, to Charles Lloyd, to Chick Corea, to Herbie Hancock, to McCoy Tyner, to Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, to Kim Kashkashian. He has also led his own bands, the European Quartet with Jan Garbarek, Pally Danielson and John Christensen, and the American Quartet with Charlie Haden, Dewey Redman and Paul Motian. And he is best known for leading his legendary trio featuring Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette. And Keith Jarrett has had two amazing careers, one in the world of jazz and the other in the world of classical. It's not hard to see why Keith Jarrett is one of the most important figures in music history. Keith Jarrett is a true living legend. And as I mentioned already, for today's special edition, I am going to be taking a look at Keith Jarrett's massive catalogue of solo piano albums, which is a total of 22 albums. And as always, I am going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. Oh boy, this is a massive challenge for me. There are no bad albums in this catalogue. Obviously, there are some that are a little bit better than others. There are some that are excellent. There are some that are legendary. And there are some that are just historic. Any one of these Keith Jarrett albums could easily be number one or an all-time favourite. You can't go wrong with Keith Jarrett. He has never ever, in my eyes anyway, has never done a bad album. All of these albums, although they're all solo piano albums, they're all different. And as you go through Keith Jarrett's solo piano catalogue, he's constantly evolving. He's constantly reinventing his sound. Obviously, when you hear Keith Jarrett, you know straight away it's him. He has such a distinct sound, and he embraces all different styles and influences, from jazz to western to blues to classical. There's also influences of Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach. It's all there, and Keith Jarrett takes all of those influences and makes it his own. And I would actually go as far as to say, in my opinion, Keith Jarrett is our modern equivalent of the late great pianist Bill Evans. But Bill Evans and Keith Jarrett, both completely different players, but for my money, Keith Jarrett, as far as historic importance is concerned, he is our modern equivalent of the late great Bill Evans, and such an amazing musician. as was Bill Evans in his prime. Both important voices for their respective generations. So we're going to start with the first album that started all of this off, and this one came out in 1972, and this one is called Facing You. So Facing You is the first ever Keith Jarrett solo piano album and his first recording for the ECM label. And this album was pretty much the one that started all of this off. It has a lot of historical importance, mainly because this was Keith Jarrett's first album that he put out under his name for the ECM label. And Keith Jarrett has been on the ECM label for virtually his entire career and has put out a lot of important recordings. This was the one that holds a lot of importance, and it's a brilliant album, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. But he wouldn't quite be the man that we've come to know him yet. But this was a great start for Keith Jarrett, and this was a huge sign that big things were definitely coming. So all of the compositions, of course, are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, and you can hear a lot of Bill Evans in his playing, so clearly he was very influenced by him. And you can also hear his classical approach and his improvising, which would, of course, go on to be one of his hallmarks and trademarks of Keith Jarrett's music. And as I said, it's an excellent album and not an easy one to find, but if you can pick it up, it's absolutely amazing. So we got In Front, which is a great opener, Rit Aurea, which is excellent, La Lin, another great track as well, My Lady, My Child, brilliant, Landscape for Future Earth is another great track, Starbright is beautiful, Rapalaya is great, and Semblance is another great song as well. But the entire album from top to bottom, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, is absolutely amazing. And the standout tracks for me are In Front, My Lady, My Child, Landscape for Future Earth, Starbright, and Semblance. But the whole album from top to bottom is just absolutely classic Keith Jarrett. And this was the one, as far as his ECM run is concerned, is the one that really got all this started. So there you have it, Keith Jarrett, Facing You, highly recommended, and a perfect place to start if you're looking to get into Keith Jarrett's solo piano work. So there you have it, Facing You, excellent album, love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1973, and this one also holds a lot of historic importance for Keith Jarrett, and it's a double live album, and this one is called Bremen and Lausanne. So Bremen and Lausanne features two live performances from the same year. So disc one is two parts, both clocking in at 63 minutes, so it's quite long. And then the second live performance, which took place in 1973 as well, Lausanne, is also 64 minutes and 56 seconds. So quite a long album altogether. And they're both live performances, and Keith Jarrett at his best playing solo piano, and it's an amazing album. It really is. And it's essentially, you could look at this as two concerts for the price of one. That's the best way to look at it. It's Keith Jarrett playing solo piano in two different places in the same year. One took place in July and the other one took place in March. So both performances took place in the same year, but at different places. And it's just an absolute amazing album for my money, and quite an easy one to get. A lot of historic importance with this one, and you could clearly see that Keith Jarrett was well on his way to becoming perhaps the greatest piano player of all time. So we're going to have a quick look. And there he is. Some historic pictures here. There's the man himself. and all compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. And here is the man himself playing solo piano. And some notes from Keith Jarrett himself. And some more notes from Jarrett. There's the man in performance mode. And some more notes here, this time from Keith Jarrett and Matthew Aisha. And some more historic pictures as well. There we go. A rare picture there of Keith Jarrett smiling. But this album, as you'd expect, absolutely remarkable. As are all of these albums. They're all brilliant. As I said, there's only 2 tracks, but both are really good. You know, as I said, it's pretty much like a whole disc of live performance. It's absolutely remarkable. And for my money, I would say both discs are incredibly strong. I wouldn't like to say one performance is better than the other. They're pretty much just continuations of one another. They're just both great, both different, but not that much different. But all of it is just an excellent album. And all of the compositions is all improvised and all composed by Keith Jarrett. And I love it. It's a fantastic album. So there you have it. Bremen and Lausanne, an excellent double solo piano live album from Keith Jarrett, and definitely one to have in your collection if you're looking to get into Keith Jarrett's solo piano work. So there you have it. Bremen and Lausanne, excellent stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1975, and this one could very well be, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest piano album of all time. It still gets talked about to this day for a lot of good reasons, and rightly so. And if I was ever going to recommend one album to someone who wanted to listen to solo piano, this is definitely the one you must have in your collection. I would recommend this one. It's an absolute classic, and it holds a lot of historic meaning. And for me, this album puts Keith Jarrett on the map as one of the all-time greats. You know the album I'm talking about. It needs no introduction whatsoever. I'm talking about, of course, the Köln Concert. So this was an important concert for Keith Jarrett, make or break, as they say. And it's so amazing. I've heard this story quite a lot, that Keith Jarrett's regular piano wasn't available, or it got held up or delayed, and they used an old beat up piano at the venue. And you know Keith Jarrett, he's such a monster player, such a perfectionist, and they had 2 options: either go ahead with the concert or cancel it. And Keith Jarrett, being the man that he is, didn't want to let anyone down, went ahead and delivered a historic performance for the ages. And this is what we have here, the Köln Concert, and it's an excellent solo piano album. Some have argued it started the whole New Age genre. That's another conversation for another time. That really depends on who you want to ask or who you want to believe, but there's no denying that this album holds a lot of historic significance and importance. And a lot of people have said that this is the greatest solo piano album of all time. I won't argue with that. I can't deny that. It's certainly up there for sure. And it's a classic. You know, every piano fan needs to have this one. It's just remarkable. So we've got 4 tracks, all written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So there's no working title. We've just got like part 1, part 2A, part 2B, and part 2C. And the shortest track is like nearly 7 minutes long. and the rest of the pieces, they're all like 19 minutes, 15 minutes, and 26 minutes long. So it's a really long album, but I tell you what, it's a great listening experience and really something you appreciate when you hear this man play. And it was just magic. It really was. From the first note he played to the last notes he played, this album truly captured lightning in a bottle, and this would put Keith Jarrett on the path to becoming, for my money, the greatest piano player of all time. And the standout tracks for me are Part 1 and Part 2A, but the whole album is just excellent. And if you were going to turn someone on to Keith Jarrett, I can't think of a better album to turn them on to than the Köln Concert. This is the one that really kicked it all off. The first two albums, they're great, but this one is not just great, it's legendary. So there you have it, the Köln Concert. Fantastic album, perhaps the greatest Keith Jarrett album of all time. Love this album, an absolute classic. Tremendous stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1977, and this one is called Staircase. So after making history with the Köln Concert, Keith Jarrett returns with an excellent follow-up, and this is a double album, and as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, it's absolutely amazing. And we've got 4 tracks that are spread out on 2 discs. We've got Staircase parts 1 to 3, Hourglass parts 1 to 2, Sundial parts 1 to 3, and Sand parts 1 to 3. As you'd expect, absolutely brilliant and a great follow-up from the Köln Concert. And Keith Jarrett was just on fire and putting out excellent albums, and nothing could stop this man. He wasn't planning on slowing down. He would just go as fast and as high as he could go. And this album, for my money, is really good and doesn't really get talked about that much, but it's definitely up there, and I think it's an excellent album. So on disc 1, as I said, we've got Sundial parts 1, 2, and 3, and then we got Sand parts 1, 2, and 3 on disc 1, and then on disc 2 we got the title track Staircase parts 1 to 3 and Hourglass parts 1 to 2, and all lovely compositions as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. And the standout tracks for me on disc 1 are Sundial parts 1 and Sundial part 3, Sand part 2 and Sand part 3. And the standout tracks for me on disc 2 is the title track parts 1 to 3, which is just excellent, and Hourglass part 2 is really good. But the whole album is just absolutely brilliant. It's just a fantastic album. Keith Jarrett at his best, playing solo piano. Doesn't get any better than that. So there you have it. Staircase, one of the best Keith Jarrett albums in his solo piano catalogue, and one that you should definitely check out. So there you have it. Staircase, brilliant album. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1978, and this is a box set comprised of solo piano performances that took place in Japan. And for me, this is a real must-have for all Keith Jarrett fans, and definitely one everyone should own. And the one that I'm talking about is Sun Bear Concerts. So Sun Bear Concerts, as I mentioned, is a 6-disc box set featuring solo piano performances that took place in Japan in 1976. And it's absolutely a remarkable collection of solo piano improvised performances from Keith Jarrett. And this box set, not an easy one to find, certainly not at a cheap price, very expensive, but definitely money well spent. And a lot of the solo piano performances took place in Kyoto, Osaka, Nagoya, Tokyo, Sapporo, and we've got as the 6-disc encores. So Very lengthy songs. They're all clocking in at 40 to 30 plus minutes long. And as I said, definitely a must have for all Keith Jarrett fans. And it's a big box set, as you can plainly see. But some excellent playing, some great material. A lot of the tracks are just named like parts one and two, so they don't really have any titles, but still beautiful playing and great music. And just sit back and relax and just take the magic in that Keith Jarrett delivers. It's just an amazing collection of live performances from Keith Jarrett. So there you have it. Sun Bear Concerts, a true must have for all Keith Jarrett fans. Definitely well worth putting your hand in your pocket for, to say the very least. So there you have it. Sun Bear Concerts, one of the finest things to ever have in your Keith Jarrett collection. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1980, and this one is called G.I. Gurdjieff Sacred Hymns. So this sees Keith Jarrett going in a completely different direction, whereas his previous solo piano albums featured all original material. This sees Keith Jarrett tackling the sacred hymns of George Gurdjieff and Thomas D. Hartmann. And Keith Jarrett, people forget that, he's a great jazz pianist, but he's also a great classical pianist as well. And this would also mark the beginning of Keith Jarrett going down the classical route, as he would establish himself in two worlds, one in the jazz world and one in the classical world. So Keith Jarrett would cross over in both worlds for pretty much the rest of his career. And this is one that really allowed Keith Jarrett to enter into a completely different style of music. And Keith Jarrett sounds absolutely fantastic. He sounds great in every setting, but I think we really get to see his playing taken to the next level in the classical world. And it's a lovely album, and it's a great listening experience. If you like classical music, this is one I would definitely recommend everyone getting into. It's absolutely a lovely album. So tracks we got are Reading of Sacred Books, Prayer and Despair, Religious Ceremony, Hymn, Orthodox Hymn from Asia Minor, Hymn for Good Friday, Hymn, Hymn for Easter Thursday, Hymn to the Endless Creator, Hymn from a Great Temple, The Story of the Resurrection of Christ, Holy Affirming, Holy Denying, Holy Reconciling, Easter Night Procession, Easter Hymn, and Meditation. But the whole album from top to bottom is just absolutely beautiful, and Keith Jarrett just sounds on top form, as he always does. It's just a really good album. And this performance took place in Luxembourg, Germany. So it's got a different feel to his previous albums. And the production, as you'd expect from ECM, is just absolutely excellent, top notch, and a true 5-star album. Doesn't really get talked about that much, but it's still definitely worth checking out. And the standout tracks for me are Reading of Sacred Books, Religious Ceremony, Hymn, Orthodox Hymn from Asia Minor, Hymn from a Great Temple, The Story of the Resurrection of Christ, and Easter Hymn and Meditation. But highly recommended. All great songs, all great playing, and just a really good, solid album. So there you have it. G.I. Gurdjieff, Sacred Hymns. Excellent stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1982, and it originally came out as two separate albums, and then it was reissued as a 3-disc album that was released in 2013, and it features two different solo piano performances, and this one is called Concerts, Breg Ends, and Motian. So both of these solo piano performances took place in 1981. And as always, Keith Jarrett always delivers the goods, and he never shorts you of lengthy material, and you're essentially getting two live performances for the price of one. So on disc one, which took place in Bregenz, you've got 4 tracks. Part 1, which is 22 minutes long. Part 2 is like 10 minutes long. Part 3, which is like untitled, is like 8 minutes long. And then we've got Heartland, which is like the shortest track on the entire album. That's like 4 minutes long. And absolutely remarkable playing. And then the second performance, which is spread out on discs 2 and 3, which took place in München. Disc 2, we got part 1, which is like 23 minutes long, and then part 2, which is also 23 minutes long. And then on disc 3, part 3 is like 26 minutes long, and then part 4 is like 10 minutes. I'll tell you what, Jarrett gives you your money's worth when it comes to lengthy material. So the standout tracks for me on disc 1 is part 1 and part 2, and the standout tracks for me on disc 2 is parts 1 and 2, and disc 3, the standout track for me is like part 3. But the whole album, all 3 discs, is excellent, and it's just a really good, solid solo piano live performance from the master of the solo piano. So there you have it, Keith Jarrett's concerts, Bregenz and München. Absolutely a must-have for all Keith Jarrett fans. Absolutely amazing album. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1988, and this one is called Dark Intervals. So just like in the name, Dark Intervals, it's a bit of a dark album, but it's still a very enjoyable album nonetheless. And as always, Keith Jarrett at his absolute best at solo piano, and it's a remarkable album. Doesn't really get talked about as much as some of the others, but still very enjoyable nonetheless. So we got 8 tracks, all written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So we got the first track, Opening, which is 12 minutes long, which is the longest track of the entire album. Then we got Hymn, which is 4 minutes long, Americana, which is 7 minutes, Entrance, which is the shortest track of the entire album, clocking in at 2 minutes, Parallels, which is almost 5 minutes, clocking in at 4 minutes and 56 seconds, Fire Dance, which is almost 7 minutes long, which is like 6 minutes and 50 seconds, Ritual Prayer, which is 7 minutes long, and then we got Recitative, which is 11 minutes long and 16 seconds, so it's like the second longest track of the entire album. And it's excellent. I enjoyed this one a lot. I went back and listened to it not too long ago, and it's a really good album. It's a very enjoyable album. And the production, as you'd expect from ECM, is excellent as always. And the standout tracks for me are Opening, Recitative, Ritual Prayer, Parallels, Americana, and Hymn. But a very enjoyable album and quite an easy one to find. If you can pick it up, get it. It's very good. So there you have it. Dark Intervals. Some great piano playing from the man himself, and an album that I would definitely recommend everyone check out. It's really good. So there you have it. Dark Intervals. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1990, and this one is called Paris Concert. So just like in the name, this solo piano performance took place in Paris in 1988, and there are 2 Keith Jarrett originals and 1 standard by Russ Freeman, not to be confused with the guitarist from the Rippingtons, and Jerry Gladstone. And the centerpiece of this live performance is the opener track, which is like 38 minutes and 23 seconds long. And it's the name of the date that this performance took place, which took place on October 17th, 1988. And then the next track we got is The Wind, which is 6 minutes long by Russ Freeman and Jerry Gladstone. And the third track, which is Blues, which is a Keith Jarrett original, which is like 5 minutes. So it's like the shortest track of the entire album. So only 3 tracks, but very enjoyable ones, as always, courtesy of the man himself. And the standout track for me, it's got to be the first track, October 17th, 1988. That in itself is worthy of being an entire disc because it's such a long track. It's essentially the whole performance. Even though there's two other tracks after, the first track is pretty much feels like the entire concert. And after it's all over, you just think, wow, that was amazing. Not so fast. We've got two more tracks to get through, but still very enjoyable. I like the other two tracks, but I think the standout track for me is the opener. I mean, it's 38 minutes long. Not going to beat that, are you? Blues is a great track as well. The Wind is another great track as well, but I do like the first track. It's just a solo concert in itself. You know, that could have been the one track on the whole album, and it still would have been good. You know, that's a true testament to Keith Jarrett's arranging and his playing. It's just excellent. So there you have it. Paris Concert, excellent album, and highly recommended that you check this one out. It's really good. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1992, and this one is called Vienna Concerts. So there's only two tracks on this album, but they're incredibly long, and it's made up of just two parts, parts 1 and 2, and very long tracks as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. And this was a solo piano performance, just like in the name, that took place in Vienna. And parts 1 is 41 minutes and 53 seconds long, and part 2 is 26 minutes and 3 seconds long, and both pieces are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So you've essentially here, with just parts 1 and 2, the length of them, you've pretty much got enough for a double album, but they managed to put it onto one disc. But I think really this could have just been made into a double because, you know, there's so much going on here. And as I said, you know, Keith Jarrett, he doesn't just give you like one lengthy track, he gives you like a whole performance. His whole performance in itself is one song. But as I said, Keith Jarrett never shorts you off material, and he always gives you your money's worth. And there's not really a track on here, it's just two lengthy pieces. So I wouldn't like to say one's better than the other, but it's one of those albums you just got to listen to it all the way through, and it's very enjoyable. And Keith Jarrett, with his piano playing, he really takes you on a journey, and you know, his piano playing just really absorbs you, and you really pay attention to everything that's going on, from all the chords to the little notes, everything that's going on. It's a real true listening experience, and sometimes it can be pleasing to the ear, and sometimes it can really be out there, but it's still an amazing listening experience. And this is definitely an album worth checking out. It's very good. Doesn't really get talked about that much. I mean, yes, all of Keith Jarrett's albums are masterpieces, but I feel that some albums get a little bit more talked about than others. But this is definitely one worth talking about, and definitely one worth listening to if you want to check out some of Keith Jarrett's solo piano work. I think this is one I would recommend also because there's some great stuff here. And even though it's only got two tracks, you see the length of how long they are. It's just, oh, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge worth accepting, and one you definitely won't be disappointed in taking on. It's a very good album. So there you have it. Vienna Concerts, excellent solo piano album, and Keith Jarrett, as always, delivered another masterpiece. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1997, and this one is called La Scala. So La Scala is a solo live piano performance that took place in Milano, Italy in 1995. And as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett playing solo piano, absolutely fantastic, great playing, and excellent production as you'd expect from ECM. And it's just a remarkable album. And it's over an hour long, so it's quite a long album. And there's only three tracks, which are La Scala Part 1, La Scala Part 2, and Over the Rainbow. So although there's only 3 tracks, it's quite a long album, and as I said earlier, Keith Jarrett never ever shorts you of lengthy material. So there's plenty of music to get your teeth into and lots of good music to sit back and listen to. And it's an excellent album, in my opinion. So we're just going to have a quick look. So there is the compositions. So 2 tracks are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, and we've got a standard, as I mentioned earlier, which was composed by Harold Arlen and E.Y. Harburg. So track 1 is 44 minutes long. Track 2, 27 minutes long. And the shortest track, which is the 3rd track, is like 6 minutes. So when you add the 2 pieces together, that in itself is a full concert virtually, And as I said, Keith Jarrett never ever shorts you of material. So there is the man, and some notes for Keith Jarrett about the concerts, and some production notes as well. So a very long album, but very enjoyable nonetheless. So good stuff. Very good stuff. So the standout tracks for me are La Scala Part 1 and Part 2. But Over the Rainbow is great, but for me, the title track, Parts 1 and 2, that's where it's at for me. It's just absolutely remarkable. And Keith Jarrett, of course, on top form, as always, with his unbelievable piano playing. And wow, highly recommended. You check this one out. Still available to buy. Definitely worth checking out for sure. And I love it. It's a really good album. So there you have it, La Scala. Tremendous stuff from the one and only Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1999. And this album was a very important one for Keith Jarrett for a lot of reasons, mainly because this marked the return of Keith Jarrett playing the piano for the first time in over a year after being out with chronic fatigue syndrome. And it looked like Keith Jarrett was never going to play again. But much to the shock and surprise and overall joy of all fans worldwide, Keith Jarrett put out a brand new album recorded in his home studio of all new material, and Keith Jarrett has never ever sounded better than he does on this next one, which for me is one of my all-time favourite Keith Jarrett albums. And the album I'm talking about is, of course, The Melody at Night with You. To come back after being diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, Keith Jarrett hasn't missed a single beat or step. He sounds as good as he ever does, and he's on fine form. And I wouldn't expect anything but the absolute best from one of the true masters of the piano. And it's a very lovely album, and Keith Jarrett is on top form, and wow, what a return. Excellent production, great playing, and I wouldn't expect anything but. Keith Jarrett, anytime you think he's down, he bounces right back up, bigger and better than ever, and he does this on this album, The Melody at Night with You. Tremendous album. So let's have a look, shall we? And there is the master himself. So a lot of the material that's featured on here is mostly standards, with the exception of one original composition, and we've also got traditional arrangements by Keith Jarrett. And Keith Jarrett, whether he's playing original compositions or standards, he sounds good as always. So I wouldn't expect anything but from a man like Keith Jarrett. And there's a shot of the album cover as well. So tracks we got here is I Loves You Porgy by Ira Gershwin and Dubois Hayward and George Gershwin. I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good by Paul Francis Webster and Duke Ellington. Don't Ever Leave Me by Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern. Someone to Watch Over Me by Ira and George Gershwin. My Wild Irish Rose, which is a traditional piece arranged by Keith Jarrett. Blame It on My Youth by Edward Hayman and Oscar Levant. And then goes straight into Meditation, which is a Keith Jarrett original. And then we got Something to Remember You by Howard Dietz and Arthur Schwartz. Be My Love by Sammy Kahn and Nicholas Brodsky. And Shenandoah by Keith Jarrett, which is an arrangement. And I'm Through with Love by Gus Kahn, Joseph Livingston, and Matt Malnick. Great choice of songs, and just like Pat Metheny, Keith Jarrett can take any song and just make it his own and turn it into a work of art. And he does exactly that with these excellent choices of standards. And the standout tracks for me are I Loves You Porgy, Don't Ever Leave Me, Someone to Watch Over Me, Meditation, Something to Remember You by, Be My Love, and I'm Through with Love. Excellent album and a great return to form for Keith Jarrett, and one of my all-time favourite Keith Jarrett albums. Absolutely amazing. To come back and put out an album like this is nothing short of amazing. So there you have it, The Melody at Night with You. Excellent return to form for Keith Jarrett and one of my all-time favourites. Absolutely love this album. Great stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2005, and it's a double album, and it's one of my all-time favourites from Keith Jarrett, and this one is called Radiance. So Radiance, as I mentioned, is a double album, and this features two live solo piano performances that took place in October 2002 in Japan. So on disc one, which is parts 1 to 13, took place in Osaka, and disc two, which features parts 14 to 17, took place in Tokyo. Excellent double live album, as I mentioned, one of my all-time favorites, and it's exactly that, as in the name of the title, Radiance. This album absolutely exudes radiance. It's fantastic, some of Keith Jarrett's best piano playing, and I love it. I absolutely love it. I think for me, I enjoy disc two a lot. You know, it just gives me chills hearing Jarrett playing, you know, just the way he's building up the music. It just builds and builds and just grows into this massive monster. It's just unbelievable, and it's a fantastic listening experience. This entire album, I just absolutely adore this one, and it's one that I listen to quite a lot, especially the last few tracks on disc two. They are just absolutely incredible. I really enjoy this one a lot. So there you have it. Radiance, one of my all-time favorites, Keith Jarrett's solo piano albums, and it's just fantastic and highly recommended that everyone check this one out. It's absolutely brilliant. So there you have it, Radiance, love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2006, and it's a double album once again, and it's one of my all-time favorites from Keith Jarrett, and this one is called the Carnegie Hall Concert. So, as I mentioned already, this is a double album that features a solo piano live performance that took place in one of the most iconic venues in the history of music, Carnegie Hall, and it's absolutely fantastic. You know, this is right up there with Radiance, and I've always looked at the Carnegie Hall concert as a continuation of Radiance because it's very similar in terms of the style of playing that Jarrett is delivering, and it's just amazing. It's just a fantastic album, and I listened to this one quite a lot. It's just unbelievable, to have Jarrett just knocking out fantastic album after fantastic album. It's just nothing short of brilliance. And for me, it's got some of my favourite songs from Keith Jarrett. So let's have a look, shall we? And there he is, the man himself. So on disc 1, we've got parts 1 to 5. And then on disc 2, parts 6 to 10. And then after that, we've got some standards: The Good America, Paint My Heart Red, My Song, which is, of course, one of the greatest Keith Jarrett compositions of all time, True Blues, and Time on My Hands. So all of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, with the exception of Time on My Hands by Vincent Youmans and Harold Adamson and Mac Gordon. But beautiful stuff, just absolutely beautiful stuff. So, iconic picture of Jarrett in the zone. That's a cool shot there. I forgot about that picture. Great stuff. And the production notes as well. So the standout tracks for me on the Carnegie Hall concert are parts 1, 3, and 4 and 5. And on disc 2, parts 7 and 8 and 10. And The Good America, My Song, True Blues, and Time on My Hands. But the whole album, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, is just absolutely first class. And when you have Keith Jarrett solo piano, you're getting the best. You always get the best from Keith Jarrett. He always delivers the goods, no matter what. And absolutely love this album. One of my all-time favourites, and one that I go back to listening to quite regularly, actually. This album has always been one of my favourites for a lot of years, and still gets talked about a lot to this day. But it's a great album. So there you have it, the Carnegie Hall Concert, one of my all-time favourites from Keith Jarrett. Excellent album, and for my money, a great continuation to Radiance. Brilliant stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2009, and it's a triple disc album, and it's one of my all-time favourites from Keith Jarrett, and this one is called Testament, Paris, London. Now, Testament features 2 solo piano live performances, which are spread out on 3 discs. The first performance takes place in Paris in November 2008, and then on disc 2 and 3, a solo piano live performance that took place in London, December 2008, at the Royal Festival Hall. I still kick myself to this day that I have never seen Keith Jarrett live. Now, when they announced that Keith Jarrett was going to be playing in London at the Royal Festival Hall, as soon as the announcements broke out, I went to get tickets for the concert, and it was completely sold out. And Keith Jarrett has not played in London since that time. And the likelihood of Keith Jarrett ever playing in London again, you never say never, but I highly doubt it. And I still beat myself about it to this day. But it's not all bad. We got a live album, and I get to hear it, but would have liked to have seen that in person. I just think that would have been an amazing experience. But aside from that, this is a great album, and Keith Jarrett is on fine form, as you'd expect, and it's a really good album, really enjoyable, great listening experience, and the energy that Keith Jarrett brings in his playing is just unbelievable, as you'd expect, and I absolutely love this album. It's just fantastic. And as I said, I would have loved to have been there in person to witness the magic that Keith Jarrett brings in his playing. So on this album, on disc 1, we've got parts 1 to 8. And then on discs 2 and 3, we've got parts 1 to 12. So great stuff, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. I think I like the London performance maybe just a little bit more. Maybe because I'm biased, but the Paris concert is great too, but I think the London one's just got a little bit more energy in there. And the enthusiasm you could hear in Jarrett's playing is just second to none. And I absolutely love this album. It's fantastic. It's one of my all-time favorites, and it's just a brilliant performance. It really is. And as much as I enjoy Keith Jarrett playing the trio, for me, solo piano is where Keith Jarrett is at his best, and he's just untouchable. He really is. And he doesn't need anyone else or anything, just him and his piano and his hands, and he lets his playing do the talking for him, and he does it very, very well. Tremendous album. Love this one. So there you have it. Testaments, Paris, London, one of my all-time favourites from Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2011, and it's another favourite of mine, and this one is just simply called Rio. So this was a live solo piano performance that took place in Rio de Janeiro in 2011, and as you'd expect, Keith Jarrett is on fine form as always, playing at his very best in solo piano, and it's excellent. It really is. So we're just going to have a little quick look at this album. I do like that. Jarrett with a little cup of coffee. So once again, this is a double album. And on disc 1, we got parts 1 to 6. And then on disc 2, we got parts 7 to 15. So 6 songs on disc 1 and 9 songs on disc 2. And all written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So there's no actual title for this album. So you could kind of look at it as Rio 1 parts 1 to 6 and Rio parts 7 to 15. So that's one way of looking at it. And a lot of the material is fairly long, you know, clocking in at 7 minutes to 8 minutes. So they're all quite relatively normal length songs. So unlike past albums where Keith Jarrett would throw you lots of big, epic, lengthy numbers, for these albums, Keith Jarrett kind of keeps it short and simple, but still quite fairly long, I think. But very enjoyable nonetheless. And the standout tracks for me on disc 1 are parts 1 and parts 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And the standout tracks for me on disc 2 are parts 7 and parts 8 and parts 10 and 11 and 12. But the whole album is, as you'd expect, it's just excellent stuff. Really good album. This one is another one I go back to quite often. So there you have it. Rio, another favourite of mine from the one and only Keith Jarrett. Excellent album. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2015, and it's another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett. And this time it's a single album, as opposed to the triple discs and double albums and box sets that we've seen already. And this is a little bit different because this next album features 4 different solo live performances that take place in 4 different countries, and it's absolutely incredible. And this one is called Creation. So Creation, as I mentioned, features 4 different solo live performances, completely improvised. One takes place in Tokyo, the other takes place in Toronto, and the other one takes place in Paris, and the other one takes place in Rome. Excellent stuff. And all of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, and they don't have any titles. It's just parts 1 to 9. So part 1 takes place in Toronto, part 2 takes place in Tokyo, and part 3 takes place in Paris. Part 4 takes place in Rome, part 5 takes place in Tokyo, as does part 6, and parts 7 and 8 take place in Rome, and part 9 takes place in Tokyo. So most of the performances predominantly takes place in Rome and Tokyo, but it's absolutely incredible, and really get to hear how Keith Jarrett plays differently in different countries. It's almost like he just completely shifts gears, and it's really enjoyable. And the standout tracks for me are part 1, part 2, and part 6, and part 7, and part 8. And it's a fantastic album, and wow, you really get to hear, just like in the name, the creation of Keith Jarrett's improvised music up close and personal. And it's just a real treat to hear the man himself at work. So there you have it. Creation, excellent album, and another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2016, and it's another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett, and this time it's a 4-disc album, and it's a must-have for all Keith Jarrett fans, and this one is called A Multitude of Angels. So this is a solo live performance that took place in Italy back in 1996, and as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, there's lots of lengthy material to get your teeth into, and each disc works out to be at least over an hour plus worth of material. And as I said before, Keith Jarrett never shorts you of lengthy material, and he always gives you your money's worth. And apart from 2 tracks, Danny Boy and Over the Rainbow, all of the material is written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So we've got performances that take place in Modena, Ferrara, Torino, and Genova, and they all sound amazing. All of these performances are fantastic, and it's not a case of which disc do you like more. You just really got to listen to all 4 discs to really appreciate what Keith Jarrett brings to the table and what an amazing player he really is. It's just a really good live album and definitely worth buying if you're a Keith Jarrett fan. 4 discs, can't go wrong. Keith Jarrett always gives you your money's worth and always pulls out the stops. So there you have it, A Multitude of Angels, another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett, and a must-have for all Jarrett fans. Excellent album, love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2018, and it's a double album, and this one is another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett, and this one is called La Finesse. So La Finesse is a solo performance that takes place in Finesse, Italy, and Keith Jarrett always pulls out the stops when he's in Italy. Italy, of course, is one of Keith Jarrett's most popular audiences, and he's on fine form as always. And La Finesse is in Venice, an absolute gorgeous place, known for its romantic setting, and having Keith Jarrett performing solo piano is about as romantic as you could ever get, and it's just excellent stuff. And as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, lots of lengthy material. All of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, with the exception of a couple of standards thrown in there. But it's a great album, and Keith Jarrett, once again, doesn't really name any of his tracks. It's just simply like parts 1 to 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. But it's all good music. It's all Keith Jarrett, and it's all excellent stuff. And the production, as you'd expect, is top notch. And on disc 1, we got parts 1 to 5, and then on disc 2, we got part 6, The Sun Whose Rays by Arthur Sullivan and W.S. Gilbert, part 7 and 8, My Wild Irish Rose, Stella by Starlight by Victor Young and Ned Washington, and Blossom by Keith Jarrett. So disc 1 works out to a total of 45 minutes of music, and Disc 2 is 52 minutes of music. So altogether it's over an hour and 37 minutes and 43 seconds. So it's quite a long album, as you'd expect. It's a solo performance and it's like you're at the concert. It is such a great listening experience, as are all of these albums. And Keith Jarrett never lets you down when it comes to his lengthy performances. So the standout tracks for me on disc 1 are parts 1 and 2, and 4 and 5, and disc 2, parts 6 and 7 and 8, and My Wild Irish Rose and Blossom. But the whole album, from top to bottom, is, as you expect, great. So there you have it. La Finis, excellent album, and another masterpiece by Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2019, and it's a double album, and this one is called Munich 2016. So this is a solo live performance that took place in Munich, Germany in 2016, and again, Keith Jarrett, very popular in Germany and always pulls out all the stops. And just like with all of these Keith Jarrett solo piano albums, never shorts you of lengthy material. And as always, Keith Jarrett doesn't really name any of his tracks. It's just parts 1, 2, and 3, and so forth. And it's a really good album and very enjoyable, great listening experience. And apart from 3 standards, all compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So on disc 1, we got parts 1 to 7, with the longest track being almost 14 minutes long, so it's like 13 minutes and 58 seconds. And then on disc 2, we got parts 8 to 12, and we've got 3 standards: Answer Me, My Love by Fred Rauch and Gerhard Winkler, It's a Lonesome Old Town by Charles Kisco and Harry Tobias, and Somewhere Over the Rainbow by E.Y. Harburg and Harold Arlen, which seems to pop up quite a few times on Keith Jarrett's albums. So he obviously enjoys playing this one a lot, and it's excellent. The whole live performance, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, is excellent. Absolutely enjoy this one a lot. And the standout tracks for me on disc 1 are parts 1, parts 4, and part 5, and part 6. And on disc 2, parts 8, parts 9, and 12, and Answer Me, My Love, and Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which I never get tired of hearing. So there you have it. Munich 2016. Absolutely fantastic double live album, and one of Keith Jarrett's absolute best ever, and another favourite of mine. So there you have it. Munich 2016. Excellent stuff, and another masterpiece from Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2020, and it's a double album, and this one is called Budapest Concert. So just like in the name, this is a live performance that took place in Budapest in 2016 at the Bela Bartok Concert Hall, and it's a double album with lots of lengthy material, all compositions written and composed by Keith Jarrett, with 2 standards, one by Charles Kisco and Harry Tobias, and one by Fred Rauch and Gerhard Winkler. So he seems to play these standards quite a lot, as they do pop up quite a bit on some of these more recent albums, and it's very enjoyable. Keith Jarrett, as always, at his absolute best, playing solo piano, and he's on fine form, and lots of lengthy material to get your teeth into. So, as always, Keith Jarrett doesn't name his compositions, it's all parts, depending on where he's playing. So, they're listed as Budapest parts 1 to 12, and it's absolutely brilliant. So, on disc 1, we got parts 1 to 4, with the longest track 14 minutes. And then on disc 2, we got parts 5 to 12, dubbed Blues. And then we've got, as I mentioned, It's a Lonesome Old Town and Answer Me, My Love. And the standout tracks for me are parts 1 on disc 1 and Part 2 and Part 4, and on Disc 2, Parts 5, Parts 8 and 9 and 10, and It's a Lonesome Old Town, and Parts 12. But the whole performance from top to bottom is just excellent, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. And I love this album, and it's another favourite of mine. So there you have it, Budapest Concert, another masterpiece from Keith Jarrett. Excellent stuff, and highly recommended you check this one out. You know, it's quite easy to get. It's still kind of fairly newish. It's been around for quite a little while now, but it's highly recommended and definitely worth checking out. So there you have it, Budapest Concert. Love it. Great stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2022, and it's another favourite of mine, and one that I've recently gone back to listening to, and this one is called Bordeaux Concert. So Bordeaux Concert is a concert that took place in Bordeaux, France in 2016, and it's a single album, and it's made up of 13 parts, listed as Bordeaux Parts 1 to 13, and all of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett, and with the exception of one track, which is 12 minutes long, most of the tracks are around 4 minutes to 7 minutes to 6 minutes to 5 minutes to 2 minutes. So they're quite relatively short-ish tracks for Keith Jarrett standards anyway, as opposed to the previous albums where you had 1 or 2 tracks which were really long, like maybe like 40 to 30 plus minutes long. So it's a nice change of pace. Still enjoy the lengthy numbers that Keith Jarrett puts out, but this is still a great album nonetheless. So standout tracks for me are Part 1, Part 4, Part 7, Part 9, and Part 12 and Part 13. But the whole album from top to bottom is just tremendous. And Keith Jarrett, as I said always, he's where he's at his best is solo piano, and it doesn't get any better than that. So there you have it, Bordeaux Concert, excellent stuff, and another masterpiece from the one and only Keith Jarrett. Love it. So which Keith Jarrett solo piano album do I think is the best one? Well, they're all great. As I said at the beginning, there are no bad albums in this catalogue. Obviously, there are some that are better than others. There are some that are brilliant. There are some that are excellent. There are some that are historic. And there are some that are absolutely legendary. But if I had to choose one that I think is the best one, it's a no-brainer. We're going with the Köln Concert. The Köln Concert is the album that put Keith Jarrett on the map and made him into a household name and an international star. And it's the one that gets talked about the most to this day, and rightly so. And it's considered to be the greatest solo piano album of all time and the biggest bestseller ever in terms of sales numbers. And it doesn't get any better than this. When you think of Keith Jarrett, you think of the Köln Concerts. It's just goes together. It just works. And if you're a piano fan, you have to have this in your collection. If you had to have one Keith Jarrett album in your collection, it's this one, hands down. The best Keith Jarrett album ever. I love Radiance. I love the Carnegie Hall Concert. I love the Melody at Night with You. I love all of those albums, but when we're talking about the absolute best Keith Jarrett album ever, we're going with the Köln Concert. It's a no-brainer. It's a classic. It's legendary. It's iconic and very popular and beloved. So there you have it. The Köln Concert, the one that I consider to be the best Keith Jarrett album ever. Absolutely love this one. Great album and legendary beyond words. Tremendous stuff. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Keith Jarrett solo piano album? Is it Facing You? Is it Bremen, Lausanne, the Köln Concert, Staircase, Sunbear Concert, J.I. Gurdjieff Sacred Hymns Concert, Greg Enns, Motian, Dark Intervals, Paris Concert, Vienna Concert, La Scala, The Melody at Night's Review, Radiance, the Carnegie Hall Concert, Testaments, Paris, London, Rio, Creation, A Multitude of Angels, La Finis, Munich 2016, Budapest Concert, or Bordeaux Concert. There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.